Welcome back everyone to our final session of the day, which is Data Education, Building the Digital Workforce of the Future. Our first speaker is Tony Scullion, who is a nationally known Scottish computer science teacher. Tony is responsible for founding the charity Dress Code, which set out to advance computing science in schools with a particular focus on closing the gender gap in computing science. She also co-founded the Ada Scotland Festival, which brings together partners involved in addressing the issue of gender balance in computing science education in Scotland. She's taught computing science at St Kentigern's Academy in Blackburn and West Lothian, and she's received a number of accolades recognising her work to advance computing science and improve diversity, including being nominated for Secondary Teacher of the Year at the Scotland Women Technology Awards. So a very esteemed speaker in the field of computing science in secondary education. Now, unfortunately, Tony was unable to be with us virtually in person this afternoon. However, she has been very kind enough to record a video addressing the issue of gender imbalance in computing science.
Hi there, my name is Tony Scullion and I'm a computing science teacher from St Kentigern's Academy in West Lothian, and I'm founder of the charity Dress Code. I'm going to be talking to you today about computing science in schools, the landscape, some of the challenges, some excellent practice that is out there, and the opportunity that we're faced with if we choose to address these problems. It has been recently reported that there is an annual requirement for an additional 13,000 digital jobs in Scotland, but we're only producing around 5,000 new recruits each year through universities and apprenticeships. This is a dramatic shortfall, and we know that inspiring pupils at a young age is crucial to solving this problem. This issue is also mirrored at secondary schools. So I want to take you back and have a look over time at the landscape of computing science in schools, focusing on the number of computing science teachers, the overall uptake of the computing science examination classes, and the gender gap. Starting at 2001, I was unable to find a reliable source for the number of computing science teachers, but the number of people studying computing science was just over 28,000. And we had just over 9,800 females studying the subject. If we look at 2008, the earliest year where I could find the number of computing science teachers, there were 766, and just over 25,000 pupils studying the subject, with just over 8,000 females. In 2010, there were 699 computing science teachers, just over 22,000 pupils studying the subject, and just over 7,000 females studying the subject. You can see that there is a decline in all three areas, and this trend sadly continues. In 2020, we had 595 computing science teachers, just over 9,800 pupils taking the subject, and only 1,895 female students studying the subject. These figures really illustrate the stark reality that Scotland is facing. We're not only facing the challenges of getting pupils to pick computing science in the first place, getting them to ultimately consider a career option or studying the subject at further education. We're also struggling to retain and replace computing science teachers, and we're ultimately failing to inspire females into the subject. So it's no real surprise that we have seen headlines such as "Computing faces staffing meltdown," "Warning over skills gap in computing," "Computing science teaching in decline," Expert calls for revamp of digital teaching in schools. And the interest is there that teachers are not. Although these headlines are written as early as 2012, almost a decade ago. The difficulties that computing science is facing in Scottish schools with recruitment of computing science teachers, the dramatic decline in the subject uptake, and the widening gender gap isn't anything new, and the writing has been on the wall for a very, very long time. Here are some of the challenges. Not all secondary schools deliver computing science. There are still far too many schools that do not offer computing science as part of the curriculum. This results in thousands of pupils across the country every year not having the opportunity to even experience the subject and decide if it is something they like. Computing science is so integral to the digital economy, and this should be a subject that all pupils should have the opportunity to study at every school in Scotland. But we know right now that we do not have anywhere near the number of computing science teachers required to have a department staffed by subject specialists in every school. We also know that access across schools that do offer the subject vary drastically. Some schools' computing science in BGE is not taught by a specialist. Some schools get no periods of computing science in S1 at all, and this means that the first time they get access to the subject is in S2. This lack of provision within BGE level in so many schools across the country has such a large impact, and there is so much lost potential and untapped talent. We also know that in some schools that deliver the subject rotate with another subject. It is quite common for computing science to be allocated one period of teaching per week. But to put this into context, for schools that rotate, there are 38 weeks in the school year. So this means in some schools, pupils only get 19 periods of computing science a year. 19 periods a year, inevitably with some lost to other activities or even holidays, is not enough time for a subject that is core to so many areas of industry and is in itself an exciting area of growth and opportunity within Scotland. Computing science needs serious attention more than ever before. We cannot afford to wait another decade. You have seen the trend over the past 2 decades with the subject going into a dramatic decline with the number of teachers, uptake, and ever widening gender gap. If left to decline further, I feel we will reach to the point of no return, where without a concentrated, expensive upheaval, the subject will linger at the fringes of education and not hold its rightful place as an essential set of skills for pupils entering a modern workforce. If we don't do something now at school level, our Scottish talent pool is simply going to dry up, and we won't have enough kids or talent coming through the system, creating their own companies, investing back in Scotland, and ultimately creating revenue. We must take action now and try more new approaches and supercharge the initiatives that are proven to be working before it is too late and the subject ultimately fades into the educational background noise. I truly believe that all these figures are solvable, although it won't be easy, and I do think that we can revive the subject. We've seen from the figures previously that it was an incredibly popular subject before, and I believe that we can get back to that and even work to surpass those figures and see the subject thrive in all schools. We have got an incredible opportunity right now to address these issues within computing science in Scotland. And although the previous slides paint a very bleak picture of computing science across the country, and that is something that should be taken very seriously, I do believe that change is coming, but unfortunately not at a fast enough rate, causing the subject to continue its decline. There are some great news stories out there, and I'm extremely fortunate to be part of an exceptional computing science department who has had a strong general uptake as well as excellent record with females picking the subject for a significant number of years. For the new academic year, we have got 7 S3 classes, 4 S4 classes, 1 NPA class, 3 higher classes, and 1 advanced higher class. And we have thought about what it is that we're doing that has created such a strong and sustainable success over the years. And we believe that part of our success involves everything that we do is collaborative where appropriate. This includes a lot of teamwork and paired programming built into our courses. We run lots of competitions and coding clubs for pupils. I really believe that extracurricular activities are so important and create a whole new avenue to spark people's interest, particularly those pupils who may not be interested in the day-to-day subject of computing science. And as you're not restricted to the number of periods or the curriculum, pupils have the freedom to explore areas that are of interest to them and excite them. I really think there's a lot of potential with extracurricular activities, and competitions are just so important. Our curriculum consists of project-based tasks. We always allow opportunities for pupils to be creative, so we use a lot of open-ended projects. Tasks are not too prescriptive. This allows pupils' imagination and interest to come into the class. Our activities rarely stay the same year on year, but these core approaches are always visible. We also believe having strong positive role models play a big part in the culture that we have managed to create and build on over the years. Our senior pupils basically run our extracurricular clubs with the support of teachers, but this creates strong links with the younger pupils who attend. We build strong pupil and teacher relationships and make sure that pupils know they are valued and understand where their skills could take them in work or study. And we help build on that confidence and seeing themselves as a successful tech practitioners. We're also an extremely strong department. There are 4 members of staff and we all love the subject and teach with so much passion and joy. And I do believe that a lot of our success stems from Brendan McCart's leadership. He has been teaching for about 35 years and has seen the subject in Scotland from the very beginning. He is the most creative, innovative, inspiring teacher that I know, who has an incredible depth of knowledge, and we have all taken his lead. We work extremely hard on our curriculum and we do not relax if we have had a good year or two. We know that it is not guaranteed and that every year group is different, and we are constantly evolving and adapting and innovating. There is no quick fix, and this has been a result of a lot of years' hard work and building year on year, but it's something that we're incredibly proud of, and you can see that this model is really working. Dress Code is a charity that I run along with Brendan and our colleague Richard Carey. We're all extremely passionate about computing science and are doing as much as we can to inspire the next generation into the subject, with a particular focus on closing the gender gap. Here is an overview of the activities that we're doing just now, but we do have a lot more exciting things to come. We run hackathons, and we also have an online pupil portal club for girls in S1 and S2. We know how busy it is and how hard it is to run lunchtime clubs, because sometimes this means that you're teaching all day long, so we've modelled it in a way that all the resources are pick up and play, and so it's really, really easy for teachers to run a club at lunchtime. We're also really excited to announce that we have recently partnered with Young STEM Leaders, so any senior pupils who run a Dress Code club in a school can gain their Young STEM Leader award that credits them with SCQF points. We nurture and mentor and create opportunities for pupils to be role models on a national level, such as the multi-award winning Turing testers, and we're also currently working with a group of primary pupils who are helping create a competition. We run multiple national competitions for primary and secondary pupils in the UK and Ireland. We have also launched Computing Science Scotland, a grassroots initiative supporting, encouraging and championing teachers who are delivering computing science. We facilitate supportive conversations and good practice on Twitter. There's also a Google Drive with hundreds of resources created by computing science teachers, and this is led by Darren Brown. We've got a magazine called CSS Reads, and this is led by Tony Harkins. And we've got a CSS Meets led by Fraser Mackay. This is incredible. So it's an online teach meet with specific focus on practical things for computing science in the classroom. This has been a sellout every time, with over 100 teachers attending each event. We've got so many exciting plans in the pipeline as well, and I'm so excited for where this project is going, and I'm so grateful for the team who have been helping me along the way. And Dress Code's most recent initiative was that we launched the Digital Technology Education Charter. The idea behind this is it's a national movement supporting computing science at schools in Scotland. We've got the talent in Scotland, we've got the global brands, we've got the energy and the will for change amongst computing science teachers, industry and organisations, and we just need to pull it together. And I hope that this charter will build the bridge between industry and education and ultimately play a big role in inspiring the next generation into computing science. You can sign up as an individual or an organisation, But a big part of this charter is helping to connect industry and teachers together to help bring the subject to life and raise awareness of the amazing opportunities that there are in tech in Scotland. But also, we've got a Choose Computing Science campaign that we'll be launching shortly, and I'm so excited about. We need to work together and make change happen and have computing science thrive in all schools in Scotland. There are also so many other initiatives and organisations out there doing incredible work to help inspire and engage pupils into computing science and also support computing science teachers. So there is great work being done out there, but we cannot be complacent and assume that things are going to be okay and that this is enough. It's good and we're going in the right direction, but it is not enough. And we can see that from the historic figures going from 28,000 pupils to just under 10,000 pupils, coupled with the significant drop in computing science teachers and the widening gender gap, is extremely alarming. It feels like we're at a critical crossroads right now, and computing science should be an integral part of pupils' education, a subject that should be taught in all schools across BGE and receive more than 19 periods a year. All pupils should have the opportunity to experience computing science delivered by a specialist teacher. If we can find a permanent, sustainable solution to delivering computing science at schools, we'll have a larger talent pool to pull from at further education and industry level, and ultimately it will benefit the digital economy of Scotland. This won't be a quick fix, and there are no shortcuts, and it will take time to see the results. This won't be something that we'll start to see a real change for a long time, but I truly believe it's something that's absolutely achievable, and we have an incredible opportunity here. But the big question is, as a country, do we want to restore the subject? Thank you so much for your time. You can see my contact information, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, ideas, or maybe something I can help with. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure now in introducing our next two speakers, both affiliated to the University of Edinburgh. Simon Chappell is Head of Data Technology at Edinburgh's Information Services Group, and Tommy Lawson is School Technology Advisor also at Edinburgh. Simon, if we can come to you first, please.
Hi, thank you very much, Tracy. Yes, I'm Head of Data Technology at the University of Edinburgh, and I also head up something known as the IoT Research and Innovation Service. And today, Tommy and I are going to talk to you about our IoT in Schools initiative.
Yeah, so I'm a teacher. I was an engineer and then a maths teacher, computing teacher, senior leadership in secondary, and then a QIO. And so I've been right round the full circle, and I'm now working between Murray House for part of the time in the Data Education and Schools team, and with Simon in the Data Technology team in the University of Edinburgh.
Yes, so the IoT in Schools initiative is part of a much wider program known as the Data-Driven Innovation Program at the University of Edinburgh, which itself is part of the university's participation in the regional city-region deal, which has put several hundreds of millions of pounds of investment into the community in South East Scotland over about 10 years, taking us through to 2027. Next slide, please.
The University of Edinburgh is helping our schools across the southeast of Scotland to build one of the world's biggest schools-based Internet of Things networks. Our schools will produce millions of data packets per day, measuring temperature, CO2, humidity, and other things in the classroom. We'll monitor air quality in the outdoor spaces or soil temperature and moisture in our school gardens. Some schools will even monitor activity in their beehives and their wormeries. Our sensor data will flow over a new high-tech LoRa network to the University of Edinburgh, where we can analyse and visualise our data. Data-driven innovation in action, empowering the data scientists of tomorrow.
Okay, next slide, please.
So as mentioned, what we're going to do next is we're going to start to roll out and build our regional sensor network in collaboration with all of the primary and secondary schools across South East Scotland. This network will be a completely unique creation. It will be quite an amazing facility enabling learning on the part of the school pupils, and there are some 130,000 or so on the school roll in that particular region, and it will introduce them and get them familiar with data from a very early age, which we think is really important in terms of developing their interest in data and their skills and certainly literacy in handling data. Next slide, please. So we're at the beginning of that particular initiative in terms of rollout to the schools now. For the last couple of years, we've been testing and evaluating the technology that we want to deploy. It's based on something called LoRaWAN, which is different to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or some of the technologies you might be familiar with. It's a completely separate kind of radio technology. Its characteristics are that it's very low power and extremely long range. So with a minimal amount of infrastructure that we deploy, we can create coverage over the whole of the region, which is roughly a geography of about 7,700 square kilometers. And we're going to be building that regional network over the coming years. Where we are just now is we're just at the start of our procurement activity here in 2021. So we'll begin to see the results of that rolling out in late summer later this year. And the first thing that will happen with those schools is to make things nice and simple. So it's really important that the technology that we're deploying is reliable and easy to use. So that's what we're creating. They're going to be a particular type of sensors. Each school will get two what are known as communication gateways. They allow for the relay of the information from the sensors back to us at the university, and there will be a pair of sensors that goes into each school, and they will measure carbon dioxide, temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, and also detection of local presence. So that's where we're going to start. And that process will take probably a period of about 18 months to get all of the technology into all of the schools. Next slide, please. Now, later on, after we get through these initial periods of engagement with the schools, we'll start to expand the range of what we do and start to deploy additional sensors beyond that initial phase. And we'll be able to do things particularly that will increase the range of activities that we can engage school pupils in, but including things like biodiversity monitoring. What you can see on the screen here is a very recent project where we deployed technology into a number of the green spaces in and around the city of Edinburgh, and it uses the same technology to relay that information back to us. And what you can see on the screen is a particular type of detection of bats taking place, an ability to develop technology which can take place directly within the sensor to measure and understand what's actually taking place in the environment. And this is a detection of a particular type of bat that's been detected. Next slide, please.
So what have we done so far? As Simon says, we've been working on this for a couple of years. Newbattle High School has been a university partner for several years now, and the learners and teachers have been experimenting with sensors and data, measuring CO2 in the maths class, temperature gradient across English department, who get the rising sun in the morning, and sound level in the workshops. And these were learner-designed investigations, and we helped them to collect the data. And one of our informatics students with a computing class helped them to visualize the data within Python. Now, both Newbattle and Roslin Primary have been working on a virtual data town model, which I'll share with you in a moment. A couple of years back, we brought together groups of learners to look at how they would design their own towns and cities. What sort of technology would they include? What sensors could be added, and what data would be collected? And how would that data be used to make the lives of our citizens better? And what were the issues around that data collection, the sharing, the use of the data? Now, we got such a positive response from these young people that the initiative, some fabulous ideas coming from our learners, and that was P5 through to S6, that we decided whilst we were still on lockdown to do a little more on this. Next slide, please. So we put together a bid to the University of Edinburgh's Data-Driven Innovation Beacon Fund for a COVID recovery grant, knowing that it would be quite a while before we could get physically back into the schools with all these real IoT sensors. We asked if we could take some of the designs coming from our learners and build them, obviously not physically into a new town on a piece of spare ground, but virtually. Next slide, please. And so we have, with the help of our learners, the town of Clydach. We're building a virtual town on a virtual island just off the coast of Fife. Now, the foundations have come from the original Data Town ideas from learners, and we're adding in some fresh ideas from schools now. The virtual town of Clydach is a typical Scottish coastal town, and it's on a virtual island of Elan Moor. There's an assortment of schools, retail parks, renewable energy plants, a farm, park. Possibilities in the future are limitless as well. Next slide, please. And to give some life to the island, we have an army of volunteers contributing voiceovers and video content at the moment. We've got farmer Jim McLeish as a voiceover in Doric, and we've got a French climate scientist and a Gaelic-speaking data technologist. So each of the so far 26 locations on the island, we are developing live sensor feeds of typical data. So for example, we're lifting the weather data from Lookers in Fife and translating that into the power generation from a wind turbine, the river flow from the rainfall, and all other entities. Now, we're lucky that we can also call upon experts across the university who know about these things to help in our design. Now, the learners have talked about the amount of traffic for air quality around the schools and for safety. So at this moment in time, we're looking at how we create a virtual live data on traffic flow and particulates, etc. So the plan is to get this live system kicking over with some live virtual data by the end of this month. Now, we're also looking at generating time-concentrated events within DataTown. When you're a learner sitting watching these live feeds, it might take a while before there's something spectacular happens. So, for example, we've lifted the historic thunderstorm from last August, and we are translating that data into data streams for the island. Not running in real time, but the entire day fits within a 45-minute lesson. So our learners can see what happens in a thunderstorm: temperature, air pressure, wind speed, rainfall, all changing. Getting the learners to think about what happens in a typical town during a weather event. What problems are there to solve, and what data do we need to solve them? With the COP26 event coming up, if we can find more funding and more partners, we'd like to look a little more at the climate challenge and tying the wider IoT project into this. As schools go live with their own physical sensors, we'll add their physical real life data on top of the virtual data. Next slide, please, Simon.
So yes, so the data town environment's incredibly important. It allows us to do the engagement with the schools before we have physical rollout of sensors and our infrastructure to support that into those schools. And the key thing is that we're going to continue with the development of that particular environment. What you can see on your screen at the moment is very early stages development as we're moving from a kind of 2D representation of data town into a 3D and very compelling and very immersive and hopefully very engaging way of presenting the environment. And as our simulations improve and our renderings improve, you'll start to see the weather effects, you'll start to see the traffic moving around in a particular environment. So people should hopefully find it quite easy to relate the information that's being captured by the sensor feeds, virtual, real, etc., to the activities which are actually taking place in the data town itself. And so this environment's quite important to us, and we'll be continuing the development through the whole of next year. Next slide, please. So that's us. It's all go for us at the moment with the IoT in Schools program. Our procurement is active at the moment, and so we're just reviewing the responses from suppliers to suppliers for the kit just now. But we'll be starting the rollout to other schools, wider schools from our test schools during September this year, if all goes to plan. And please do get in contact with us. Data Town itself is something that we're going to have an event at the end of this month on July the 30th. And so if you're interested in that, please do get in contact with us. Tommy's much better at talking to you about the educational aspects of what we're doing. And I'm probably the person to talk to from the technical point of view. So our email addresses are there. And we look forward to getting more feedback from other people who'd be interested in what we're doing. So thank you very much. I'll leave the last word with Tommy.
That's all, folks.
In true cartoon style, thank you for that, Tommy, and thank you to both of you for that little insight into what's happening in Edinburgh with your Internet of Things initiative. Really quite groundbreaking, and as an ex-primary school teacher, incredibly exciting. The kind of thing that I would have loved to have got my teeth into if I was still in the classroom. Really, really great stuff, and brilliant to see it happening in Scotland. It is now time to move on to our final expert panel of the day, which leads me to introduce our panelists who are joining us along with Tommy and Simon. We also have Mark Logan, who is joining us from Glasgow University, where he is Professor of Computing Science. We are delighted to have Fiona McNeill joining us also from Edinburgh University. We have quite a team from Edinburgh today. Fiona is a reader in computing science and computing science education in particular. And finally, we have Claire Gillespie joining us from Skills Development Scotland. Claire is Digital Technology Skills Manager there. So welcome to all of you. And if I kickstart with a question, a reminder to all delegates, if you post questions for our panel in the Q&A, I will pick them up. Here's a question, and obviously questions I will pitch broadly, but some may be particularly targeted at certain individuals. A question for yourself, Claire. How do we inspire young people at school to be interested in data? How do we hook them into data? What is the hook?
Thank you, Tracy. I'm delighted to be here today. So I think a big part of inspiring young people about data and technology more widely is about bringing in additional inspirational activities. So we do a lot with our industry partners, with colleges and universities to add value to what the teachers do as part of their curriculum. And I'm very much against the idea of sort of parachuting in and doing one-offs, but very much adding value around what the curriculum is teaching young people and what the teachers are doing kind of on a Monday to Friday basis. So things that are mapped to that curriculum experience, but bring data and bring technology to life. So, you know, Tommy was talking there about kind of an IoT and climate experience, and there's a project that we do around Discover Cyber and Discover Data, which is about running live lessons and kind of competitions, again, similar things to what Tony was talking about earlier today, which bring the subject to life, bring the kind of real world industry element into it, and contextualise it, which I think is also massively important for young girls. A lot of young girls, unfortunately, aren't interested in technology and data for technology's sake, but what they do want to do is make a difference to the world. For example, they're very interested in things like, you know, the climate environment challenge. And I think employers are such a big part of this, but very much has to add value to the curriculum, you know, adding value to those curriculum outcomes and experiences, and making sure it's a really joined up experience. And we've got great examples of this happening across a range of schools in Scotland. And I think we've got really good foundations to build on, Tracy.
Thanks for that, Claire. Do any of our other panellists want to come in with your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Claire says is really valid. I think it's about the inspiration, and I think it's really about challenging the stereotypes. We know that in Western culture, there's very negative stereotypes about computing, which put all kinds of people off, but particularly girls. And we really need to get those role models in front of them and to help them see that it's not all about just being a geeky coder. That stuff is so visible, that kind of geeky stereotype around computing. So we need to make the positive stuff really visible too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would concur with that completely, that it's very much about contextualizing and making it meaningful. There's real life connections, but also making it engaging for as broad a range of learners as possible. Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, I often reflect, Tracy, that computing is a magical subject. You can take ideas from your head and bring them to life and get a computer to do something real world and useful. And that's somewhere along the line, we've taken that magic out in how we teach it at schools. We're turning students off, as we've seen from Tony's data. And I think the way you bring interest back into it is, Fiona and Claire both touched on it. There's a number of things we'll get into in this discussion, but one of them is undoubtedly projects, real world projects, applications of the capability are exciting and interesting, and learning about GDPR or writing functional specs that are examinable is not interesting. So that we've got a curriculum problem amongst other things, but the more time we can put into projects that are exciting and demonstrate the power of the subject and solve problems, I think that's a big part of how we elevate the subject.
What is the role of industry? Obviously, there's a focus here on what we do as educators to inspire and motivate and generate that interest and to contextualise. But looking more broadly, beyond education, what is the role of industry, do you feel, in inspiring young people about tech and about data?
Is that for me?
And that is open to whoever wishes to come in first.
Shall I start, and I'll happily hand over to the other folks in the call here. Industry is one of the routes into exciting projects. That's the first thing. And the second thing is industry is able to demonstrate to students why the subject's worth pursuing, because there are great careers in the future in front of them, something which I don't think is well understood at parental level in schools. I think part of the problem is we need to educate our parents as to why their children should be interested in this subject. And I've been really struck, because I've sort of got more into examining the state of the subject, how increasingly keen industry is to be involved. And I think industry recognises the crisis that's ahead. Well, it's really here just now, but we've got a whole tech ecosystem that we are celebrating and trying to improve, and there's a lot of focus on that, but we're cutting the legs underneath it because we've got a dramatically falling number of children studying the subject, and they are the startup founders of the future, the engineers of the future. So I think industry recognizes that crisis and wants to play its part. I would say, though, that industry's ability to fix the fundamental crisis is limited, because they can do second order things like exciting projects, but that's not the fundamental issue that we're facing. It's only one of them.
If I want to go next, Tracy, I'd very much echo what Mark said there, and I think industry's role is to add value to good foundations, and I think we need really good teachers, computing science teachers in every school in Scotland, and part of that is around the kind of inspirational career message and the kind of project contextualisation piece. I think there's also a massive opportunity around employers giving young people work experiences and letting young people, and again particularly girls, understand what a real technology workplace looks like. There's lots of preconceptions about who works in a tech workplace and what they look like, and that kind of idea of being very male dominated, which obviously is, but I think that's very much changing just now. And there's a range of interventions, things like ePlacement Scotland and our SDS's Foundation apprenticeships, where we're encouraging employers to offer work-based learning experiences and work-based placements to young people to allow them to experience that world of work and put some of those skills they're learning in the classroom environment into practice in a project work-based environment. But absolutely, there's a strong appetite from employers to do this, but it has to be adding value. Although we have a lot of co-delivery opportunities for employers and teachers to work together, the employers aren't there to teach, they're there to add something extra to inspire young people. And also, I think they have a role in informing the curriculum and making sure the curriculum stays up to date. So I work with a lot of industry partners to make sure that they're feeding their insight into the school's curriculum, into college and university curriculum and apprenticeships, to make sure that we're not just fit for purpose for today, but we're looking forward 3, 5, 10 years down the line. But I don't underestimate how hard it is for employers to understand what they need in the future, and also for our education system to be agile as well.
I agree. I think industry really has an important role to play. I think industry can do a lot in outreach. So I used to organise a nationwide outreach scheme, and we would have engineer mentors assigned to every team, which was mostly upper primary school, some lower secondary school, particularly the schools in the deprived areas. And the mentors would go in and sort of help them out with what they were doing, which is building robots and programming them, but also talk a lot about their jobs and what they did and how they came to be there. And the kids love that. It's really inspiring. And I think that relationship is really useful, especially if it can be sustained over time. Some industry, some businesses are great at this, and they encourage their staff to go out during work days. They give them days when they can do volunteering, and they set things up. And these kind of long-term relationships between people in industry and schools can be really valuable, although it's quite difficult to scale to make sure that that's actually being delivered equitably across the country. But I think there's a lot of really powerful inspiration that can be done there. And as Claire says, I think industry's role in pointing out why this is really important and how industry does depend on this, and making sure that computing education is going in a helpful direction is also really crucial.
Thanks for that, Fiona. A comment here from one of our delegates, Michael Conlon. Michael saying that a device for every child sets up an opportunity to plot learner journey much better in BGE. The first experience with computing science should never be secondary. It would afford the opportunity for more extracurricular and more tinkering in their own time. I would certainly support that, but I do think, again, as an ex-primary practitioner, that over the past 15 years or so, the amount of computing science that's happening in primary schools has accelerated exponentially. It really has, which is encouraging. But let's have a little broaden this out a bit. So in our video, Tony raised some very pertinent issues and concerns around computing science. The problems that we're seeing just now in computing science, how do they compare with what's going on in other STEM subjects? Is this a problem, like a STEM problem in general, or is it something more specific to computing science? And that's open to the panel.
Well, I sit on the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Learned Societies Group for STEM Education, where we have representatives of all the different STEM learned bodies. I represent the BCS on that. So we talk a lot about STEM education in general, and we look at the figures and so forth. And so I think the figures clearly show that a lot of the problems that we're facing in computing are STEM problems, and they're happening in most of the STEM subjects. It's not always the same. Biology is sometimes a bit of an outlier, especially in terms of gender issues. But in terms of things like, for most of the STEM subjects, the gender balance, the fact that that numbers are going down of people taking subjects at exam level, the fact that we don't have enough teachers, the fact that we have multi-level teaching going on, this is happening in all STEM subjects. However, it does become a bit of a running joke in the LSG, because every time we get the figures, we say, oh, this is all really bad. But it's worse in computing. It's always worse in computing. All these figures are worse for computing. So I think there's a lot that we can do. I think collaborating with other subjects can be really helpful. There's a lot of shared issues, things like The narrowing of subject choice at Nat 5 is pushing all STEM subjects out. The fact that multi-level teaching is happening, where teachers are teaching different levels in the same classroom, is happening. I think that's happening more in computing, probably because the numbers are lower. But I think there's also something a little bit different going on with computing, which I think may be to do with the fact that it's really important to have people educated in all STEM subjects. But the need for that in the economy and in general life skills hasn't really changed that much. It's stayed fairly constant. Whereas in computing, we've seen this complete paradigm shift from computing being a bit of a niche kind of hobbyist thing to being underpinning the whole economy and being an absolutely crucial life skill. So just as we want, pretty much everyone in society to have basic numeracy, that's essential life skill. We need people to have basic understanding of the computing devices that they're running their life through. And I think that we haven't seen this change in how we live hasn't led to a change in how we're educating in computing. And I think that that shift is something that we really need to see.
Thanks for that, Fiona. Okay, here is a question particularly for Mark from one of our delegates, James Bissett. James would like to know, Mark, in your technology ecosystem review for Scottish Government, you recommend that computing science in schools needed to be accorded a similar position in the curriculum as maths and physics, which implies a number of things, including curricular time and staffing, which we know is a challenge. How do you and the rest of the panel see progress being made towards this goal?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I think the first thing is a country, and by say country, I mean, if you think how many different agencies touch education, it's a lot. You've got Learning Directorate, Education Scotland, SDS, the local authorities, headmasters and mistresses have got all got a hand on this tiller. I think the first thing we've got to decide is how, do we think the subject matters? And I'm not convinced today that Scotland thinks the subject matters. And it matters because of what I said earlier, that it underpins our entire tech ecosystem, which is worldwide one of the fastest growing opportunity sets for people with highly paying jobs. So it really matters economically to Scotland. But my first question to the senior leaders of all those organisations is, do you agree that it matters? And I'm not sure what the answer is yet. I'm very grateful for Kate Forbes' leadership in this area, along with the overall review recommendations. But I'm not sure that across all our agencies, across all those different stakeholders, that we agree that it really matters. I think the second thing then is, if we do agree it matters, do we agree it's in crisis? Because if we don't agree it's in crisis, we're not going to take the right actions. Now, it was interesting, the question that you asked Fiona there, how does computing science compare? I was very struck by the numbers that Tony shared. I've seen them before. And if I was to put it like this, if mathematics participation had fallen to a third of its former value among students, would we see that as a crisis in mathematics? And I think we would. Now, that's exactly what's happening in computing science. If mathematics wasn't offered in many schools to any pupils, or wasn't offered until third year, would we think that was sufficient? And I think we all know the answer to that. If the business studies teacher was teaching mathematics because no one else wanted to do it, would we think that was okay? Now, that's exactly where we are today in computing science. Where I would maybe go further than Tony did, I don't think we're heading towards a crisis. I think we're in the death throes of the subject, because in the latest stages, you see a collapse in numbers. We're not seeing a decline in numbers, we're seeing a collapse in numbers. And we're caught in a vicious circle now where teachers are leaving the profession with low morale because the subject doesn't matter, which is driving pupils away from the subject, which is driving teachers away. So I think we've got to decide, do we believe we're in a crisis? And I would submit that we are, but I would love to hear the senior leaders of all the stakeholders agree with me. If they don't, then it's going to be very hard to take the action we need to take. And then when you look at that, what action that might be, well, there's a number of things, but I think it's a very good strategic rallying call to say that we need to treat the subject with the same importance as mathematics. Because, as Fiona just mentioned, mathematics underpins every science. so does computing science. You name me a science these days that doesn't rely wholeheartedly on computing and programming and the data science, and Claire touched on this earlier. And that's why it's important to put the subject in that footing. Now, the way to answer the question of what should we do, well, let's go back to the question of if mathematics had lost 30% of its teachers, if it lost 66% of its students, what actions would we take? We would probably have a very urgent campaign to double the number of teachers, perhaps to pay them the level required to attract them into the industry, and so on. We've got a sub-crisis in teacher recruitment, so you would have a strategy to address that. We'd address the things we've touched on earlier, like why is the subject so boring to students? Students talk to other pupils in other years about don't do computing science, it's boring. How have we made the subject boring? How would we restore that? I think projects are a big part of that. I think best practice teaching concepts are a big part of that. I think a big part of doing that is to empower the teachers who are running the interesting projects, the Tony Scullions of this world, to give them the time to support other teachers in the profession. And we've got to recognise that not only do we have a recruitment crisis, but we have a current crisis in skills amongst teachers, because as Fiona mentioned, computing science changes so much, so that, for example, 10 years ago, if you graduated as a teacher, you hadn't done any app development. Look at the world now. So we need a programme to actively upskill and equip our teachers to be able to teach the subject, run those exciting projects we've talked about, and restore the pedagogy of teaching children how to program computers to its rightful place. So I could say more about this subject, but these are the sort of things that I think matter. But we've got to, across our agencies and across government and across the LEAs, etc., first of all, accept that the subject matters and that it's in the real crisis now, and take appropriate actions.
Thanks for that, Mark. Fiona, Claire, would you like to add to that?
Maybe kick off and answer, Mark. I'm not sure how huge amounts more to add, and I can't speak from other public sector agencies. I think from an SDS perspective, I think we absolutely see technology, computing science as being massively important. And since 2014, have been working on a range of interventions in schools and outside of schools to make sure people understand the importance of computing and wider technology skills. And I think when your question around comparable to other STEM subjects, I think the big challenges are in computing science teachers. Until we have computing science in every school and computing science teachers in every school, I think we've got such a big challenge in our hands. It's not just about the skills development, that's also a big part of it, but how can we be inspiring young people about technology careers when there's nobody in that school talking about it every day of the week and teaching that subject every day of the week? So I think that's a massive challenge, and the government obviously have targets and schemes, the bursary scheme, to attract more people into computing science, and the part of that is making sure we get the right people with the right skills. And I think technology jobs are so buoyant just now. People with computing science and technology degrees tend to go down the kind of private sector route. Mark's kind of touched on some of this, and I think one of the big challenges we face is that it falls to so many different departments and so many different organisations to address this. And we all own a little bit of the puzzle, and we're maybe all moving with different plans at different times and different objectives. And that has to be aligned. We have to come together. There's no point having, that's not no point, but we undermine having computing science teachers in every school. We don't have young people selecting the subject, for example. All these bits of the puzzle have to come together at the same time. And I think from a government and funders perspective, we also have to accept this is not a quick change. This is a long-term change project. We're not going to get quick wins. So we're going to have to make a lot of investment and a lot of decisions in the short term and not see this impacting for a number of years. And that's difficult, I think, when we're looking at annual budgets and annual plans. So a massive challenge. And I think I can talk for SDS. We're hugely supportive of this. We only own a little bit of the puzzle, but really keen to make sure that we do our piece around apprenticeships and the careers advice, and keen to facilitate and kind of rally other organisations around it.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I've just got a couple of points I'd like to add. One is that I think there's a bit of a cultural problem in schools around computing. So the Royal Societies, after the Reboot report, highlighted the fact that it's very common in schools for computing to be viewed as quite a specialist subject and quite a hard subject. And their schools are sometimes actively discouraging students who aren't the really strong students away from computing and viewing it as, you know, if you're really clever and you kind of got an interest in computing, maybe it's for you, otherwise it's probably not for you. They don't see it as a subject that's for everyone. That's a huge issue. We really need to address that cultural problem. And the other thing I would say is that all of these bodies, all of these different players are really important that you're talking about. I think also really important are young people. I think we need to be working a lot more with young people and talking to them about how they're making the choices and how they view computing, and have that feeding into the decisions that we're making. So in the Scottish Computing Education Committee, we've got a young persons advisory group who have just they're just doing some research right now to try and find out a little bit more about what young people in schools across Scotland think about computing. They've just developed a questionnaire which they're now beginning to send out. So I might, if people don't object, just put that in chat. If people are interested, just send it out into schools and get it to as many young people as possible. I think that'd be really helpful.
Thanks for that. A few other comments and questions from delegates. A follow-up from James Bissett to his question. Is it a problem that computing science isn't required as a course of study prerequisite to any CS course at higher ed?
I think that's more an indictment of the subject at school level. The fact that the universities don't value it is an indictment that we have to address. And you know, I'm struck. I've spent 30 years in industry, but I'm now teaching at Glasgow University, and I'm struck that there's and I don't think this is peculiar to that university at all. There's a first year sort of remedial programming class for students entering, and an advanced programming class. And the reason I have the two classes is because, you know, not all students arrive with the same level of programming. And guess which students arrive into the remedial class? It's largely the Scottish students. And the comment was made to me that one of the tragedies about Brexit is all the good students won't be coming anymore, i.e. the non-Scottish students. Now, that's not a commentary on the innate intelligence of any nation. It is an indictment of our ability to teach children how to program. So, you know, I think we have to look at it in those terms, and somebody has to actually care about that. My experience of poking into this issue is that, Claire mentioned there's just so many agencies involved, and I think nobody really feels single ownership of this, and that's a problem. So there tends to be a feeling of, well, you know, collectively as a country, we're shrugging our shoulders about this issue. That's the strategy, to shrug our shoulders. I think we need to get the most senior folks in each of those stakeholder groups together and create a strategy that addresses these issues and is sufficiently embarrassed and ashamed by the status quo that we actively mean to do something about it.
A couple of other comments here from delegates. One from Kate Farrell, who's an ex-computing teacher. She's saying that we also need to do something in Scotland about supporting teachers to stay in the classroom. So many pieces of the puzzle: curriculum, time, teachers, equipment. How do we get the support and funding we need from Scottish Government? There's a $64,000 question.
So I don't know how we get it, and hello Kate, I know Kate well, but I think it's massively important. So I think, you know, we talk a lot about adding new teachers to the ecosystem, and we need more people, and at the same time we're losing teachers, and we just can't allow that to happen. And I know there's been a lot of research to understand. I think Mark, you referenced some of it earlier about staff morale, for example, and supporting teachers around CPD, making sure they feel confident in teaching the subject. So I probably don't have an answer. I suppose I'm just flagging. I think it's a massive piece. We can't be losing teachers at the same time when we're struggling to add teachers. Otherwise, those numbers will continue to go down year on year. But how you get money out of Scottish Government, and I suppose first of all, it's understanding the problem fully. So if we are looking for money, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What's the thing that would make teachers stay in the classroom, whether that's salaries? Mark, I know you mentioned that earlier, whether it's kind of wider, you know, conditions that are a challenge for them. I probably don't have that level of insight, unfortunately, Tracy.
But I guess, as Kate pointed out, that Judy Robertson did some really great research around how young people are making those decisions. And a lot of the things like received wisdom, like they're not going into it because they make so much more money in industry, it didn't really feature so highly. Actually, the salaries are not as different as you might think, unless you're really at the high end of industry. And and making money wasn't such a motivating factor. And there's some really great insights in that into how we can encourage more people into computing, what the problems are and what they aren't, into computing teaching. So I think taking the research that we have and doing stuff with it is really important.
It's interesting that there's a lot of subjects at university where people learn to program, physics, chemistry, lots and lots of subjects we'd be recruiting from. And I don't think we're doing that. So I don't know if it's because they perceive that the starting salaries aren't good and we need to correct that understanding. I don't know if it's just that no one's really explained what teaching is to them. But what I do know is that of the people who do start PGDE courses at the universities who actually teach that, 50% of them drop out. 50%. And the reason for that apparently is that the programming is too difficult. So that tells me that we're not recruiting really from subjects where people are comfortable in programming, not sufficiently. I think we've got to really reflect on that. And another important point we just covered there is, and from one of the comments on the chat, that what do we do about teachers getting time in the classroom? I think we're in such a sparse situation now that if you try and get a teacher out of the classroom, the answer is you can't, because they're needed here. So we've got so few teachers now, we can't even get them out of the classroom to upskill them, reskill them, have build morale and identity and community, have national conferences, because they can't get out of the classroom because there's so few of them. And that fact will drive more teachers out of the profession. So that's why I say that we're now, this isn't when populations decline, they don't decline linearly. It all looks okay for a while and then it does this. And that's what's happening now. And you see that in the numbers. So I think it's vitally important that we aggressively review our recruitment policy, and whatever the reasons are that were identified in the report you mentioned, Fiona. We've got to act on those. It has to be the case that none of my 125 students, fourth year computer science students, have any intention of going into teaching. That can't continue. We've got to fix that, or the problem will become terminal. So if I sound passionate and concerned about this, I'm extremely concerned about it, and I would like to see that level of concern mirrored in the most senior parts of the stakeholder groups we've mentioned, because it's much later than we think. We've got very little time to fix this.
Sorry.
I was just going to point out there's lots of logistical problems. For example, students who are really interested in computing very often don't do English at higher, and they're not encouraged to do English at higher. But then if they don't have English higher, they can't go into teacher training, and there's no support anywhere, as far as I can see, to help students who don't have higher English go into teacher training and catch up on that as they're doing it. So I've had some really excellent computing students who really wanted to go into teaching and gave up in the end because they didn't have English higher. So issues like that, we need to not necessarily lower standards, but think about more imaginative ways to allow students to take different paths.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, Fiona. And again, speaking from an ITE perspective, it's about increasing opportunities and being not necessarily creative, but just widening opportunities to attract the candidates that we want to attract, and that they're not being put off, or as Mark said, not even considering it as an option, which is something that we want to reverse. Just coming back to what we were talking about, Kate was mentioned getting support and funding from Scottish Government. One of our other delegates, Ben Ledbetter, has asked, at what level should these issues be initially addressed, and which area do you think would have the biggest impact? So at Scottish Government at strategic level, or then secondary academic leadership school level, or primary school leadership level? And where do you see this, building from a grassroots, or do we need to start at a national strategic level?
I think the challenge is actually neatly encapsulated by that question, because if you start at a national level, you will hear that the trouble is you've also got to convince the local education authorities, otherwise it's all a waste of time. If you start at that level, you'll be told that you've really got to engage national government or it's a waste of time. And both groups will tell you that if the head teachers aren't interested, then it's a waste of time. And how do I know that? Because I've been spending the last 8 months having those conversations. Now what I know is that there's a will in central government, a strong will, with the personal backing of Kate Forbes, John Swinney, and to address this issue. And with our new education minister, we have that support continued. So that's good. I think we then need to hear the same from bodies like Education Scotland, and we need to engage the local education authorities and have them sign up to the same thing, and collectively engage with our headmasters and mistresses to address this issue too. I think if we don't do that, then we'll all just look at each other like a bad card game in a bad Western. So we've got to together address this issue. That's the problem. I was hearing an anecdote from Ross Tuffy just a couple of weeks ago that one head teacher was taking computing science down further in terms of number of hours to support home economics, or its equivalent subject nowadays. And we've got to change that, and we won't change it in any one area. We've got to change it in all areas. So I think we have to again come together as a country, treat this like COVID. It's a crisis. It's just unfolding at a different speed, and ask what would we do if we really believed it was a crisis? What would we do collectively?
I would agree, Mark. I think we have to deal with all these different layers in parallel. I think we need to have government support, which I believe we do have, and Mark, you're obviously well connected into government and Miss Forbes. But we also have to engage with local education authorities and teachers and head teachers. And I think part of that is actually about bringing, I mentioned that it's a change project, bringing all those people who are part of that change with us and listening to them as well. I think sometimes as national agencies and people involved in this space, sometimes our ideas, they need tweaking and they need kind of practitioner input to make sure that we're doing things right and we're taking account of some of the reality. But also as organisations who want to make change happen, we have to push boundaries as well. But I think these things have to happen at the same time. I think and also from a time point of view, I think if we do one and charge along getting government and ministerial support and not doing the head teachers and doing the schools at the same time, we're just extending how long this is going to take to actually affect change and make things happen. And at grassroots level, I think we have to engage with teachers, but I actually think we're pushing a very open door. Again, hearing from Tony today and speaking to a lot of teachers, there's a strong appetite to make change happen. There's a lot of amazing good practice. I think the problem with good practice is it's little pockets, and we need to work out how to scale it and keep get consistency and get a quality of access for all teachers and for all young people across Scotland. So very much a joint partnership Scotland-wide project opportunity, I think, needs to be taken forward.
Interesting here, I've got a comment from another delegate who's in effect, to paraphrase, saying, how do we win the hearts and minds of our academic leaders? And they give the example of students in their establishment, age 11 to 13, who have 7 periods of Latin a fortnight and only 2 IT lessons in that same time frame. We're pushing an open door. Some doors are open, others are apparently bolted.
I think that's a great illustration of what Claire just said, that if we don't bring the head teachers along, this can all be undermined. And I do agree that the reason morale is falling amongst computing science teachers because of all the things we've just discussed, but amongst so many of them, the desire to put this subject where it should be is very strong. I mean, look at the great work that Tony and others that she mentioned do, and they're not the only ones. We would do well to harness that energy and listen to teachers and ask them what they need and help them implement that. But we absolutely do need head teachers to understand. I think the task is, before we can educate the children, we've got to educate the head teachers. Some of them really get this, and some of them really don't.
There's a big hearts and minds issue in schools, I think. As I kind of mentioned earlier, I was talking to my daughter's careers advisor. She was just making her choices for Nat 5, and I had a quick chat with the careers advisor, and I said, what about computer science, to see what she's saying. She was like, yeah, I mean, I guess if she's interested in going into programming, maybe. And that was it. That's all she saw it as. Maybe a bit of, if you're a programming geek, maybe, from a careers teacher. And I think there's a lot of lack of understanding about what opportunities are out there for young people and how much opportunity they're creating for their students, which they really want to do. You know, they don't. We need to make them see how computing really supports that, and I think there's a lack of understanding in a lot of schools.
I would say, actually, again, as an ex-primary practitioner, it's from the very outset. We talk about 3 to 18, from early level, it's just embedding computing science and making children, from the early stage, aware of how the connections between the skills and critical thinking involved in computational thinking, and links across all different other curricular areas and real life applications. And if we could hook them in at that stage and have primary practitioners engaging in innovative practice, which I know is happening, but again, it needs to be more, needs to be scaled up and to be consistent. Then hopefully when we get to BGE, we can have more consistency there as well.
I think people still just don't get how important digital is to Scotland, to the whole economy, and that digital is not optional. As we've all mentioned, there's such a diverse range of digital jobs in Scotland with huge salaries. And I don't want to undermine where Latin might take you, for example, but I think with a computing science and technology background versus a Latin background, I'm going into dangerous territory, I know. I think I know which one's going to get you a job and get you a more sustainable job and maybe even a slightly better paid job. Obviously, we come with a bias. But I think a lot of people still don't get this, and in public sector agencies and schools, a whole range of individuals. They sort of think digital is important and we talk about digital, but it's kind of a throwaway comment. And actually, if you unpick their understanding of it, they don't really understand. And not even just digital professionals, that kind of hybrid skill set, but every job in the future, if not today, has a huge part of digital, as part of everyone's job. And digital being very much an employability skill as much as a professional skill as well. And I think we've all got jobs, including the media as well. I think sometimes the media can do digital a bit of a disservice and create quite a negative view of the digital world and robots stealing people's jobs. I think we have a role to make sure people fully understand the digital opportunity in Scotland for young people and also for career changers as well, potentially.
Okay, James has just come back there at you with your Latin. With respect, some of the best programmers come from a classics background because Latin teaches you grammar problem-solving skills, which transfer really well to computing science.
I agree, I should apologise. And actually, it's really interesting. So a lot of employers will tell me some of the greatest students or greatest hires are non-technologists who've come with language skills, for example, because it's a way of thinking, a computational thinking. So I apologise. I use that example for effect.
But I think it is a great...
James isn't a Latin teacher.
Okay.
I think it's a great strength of computing that you can come into it at a later stage. You don't have to study in schools. You don't even have to study at uni to come into industry. And that's great. And we should really capitalise on that. I think the risk is, though, if students never study computing and they never see what's interesting in computing, even though they could do that, they're maybe not very likely to. So I think that's why it's really important to have computing embedded all along, even though we can bring people outside of that in at a later stage.
And at 2 minutes to 4, can I take the opportunity to thank the three of you for joining me today for this particular session. It has been very insightful. A lot of important points have been raised, and I think that with all of these kind of discussions, it's important that there's an impetus and that we move forward with this, and this acts as a catalyst for change. I think we really, as educators, have a real responsibility to be pushing this agenda. So I'm hopeful that we can take this forward positively. But thanks you to Mark, to Claire, and to Fiona for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's conference, our virtual EduTech 2021. It has been a fabulous day with a whole host of inspiring speakers, some excellent examples of innovative practice, and a lot of encouragement and positives to be taken as well, whilst at the same time acknowledging, and it's important that we do so, acknowledging that not just in computing science but in other aspects of digital, that we still have a way to go. It was fabulous getting an international perspective and seeing what we can learn from international partners. And hopefully, as I think all of our speakers have echoed, that we can continue to work collaboratively to initiate positive change in digital education. So thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully in the future we may well be able to meet in real life, but I think definitely this digital platform will play some part in future conferences as well. So finally, thank you for joining us. I was about to say safe home. You are already home, so thank you. Goodbye.